Hello everybody, welcome back. This is Asura at Asura Psych, and today we're going to be talking about the MBTI in comparison to the Big Five. So these two tend to be the most popular personality assessments currently in the world, really, at least the most known. And I want to kind of talk about what they are and the differences between them, because they are both very important, but in reality they're used for two different things. So people have come up to me on forums and asked, well, what do you prefer, Big Five or MBTI? And I say, well, I use them both, and there's reasons I use them both, because they're not intended to measure the same thing. So in this video, we're going to go over what the differences and similarities are between the two. All right. Let's begin with a brief history of what the MBTI is. So the MBTI began development in 1917 by Catherine Cook Briggs. She was then, a few years later, inspired by Carl Jung's book, which was translated and released in English in the year 1923. To sum up the next 50 or so years pretty briefly, her work was continued by her daughter Isabel Briggs Myers, who graduated first in her class from Swarthmore College in 1919. So they kind of compiled their ideas and their research on personality. I'm not going to go into too much detail on what they did and how they did that. And they published their first handbook in 1944. This gained attention, and eventually a manual was published in 1962. Now, it's important to note that at this point in history, science and psychometrics was kind of in its infancy. It was very kind of easy to just get into the field of psychometrics and kind of release what you wanted to release. And that's why it was probably easier for her to release this kind of manual, because it made sense. It was the data was more than a lot of people were doing at that time. So she eventually passed away in 1980, Isabel Briggs Myers, and there went on to be two more editions of this manual released. The current one is the third edition, released in 1998. Now, in terms of what the MBTI is, it is designed to explain the differences in individuals in a simple way. It's primarily focused on perception and direction of one's energy and natural habits. It focuses on communication and coming together. And one thing that people tend to not understand about the MBTI is that it isn't intended to measure how much of something you have. It is only intended to put you into a category. For example, if someone comes up to me and they say, well, the MBTI says that I'm 90% introverted, I would say, no, that's not really what it's intending to do. It's saying that you're more so in the field of introversion. You're not being measured on how much of an introvert you are. Another big important thing to remember about the MBTI is that while it is grounded in psychometrics, while she attempted to create this tool using scientific method, essentially, it is far more of a qualitative tool. And that is to say that it is far more based on practical and subjective use than it is on scientific and number-based research. And this is really important to remember, especially when you're comparing the MBTI in the Big Five, because the MBTI is far more considered a soft science with practical use. And this shows itself in the fact that business corporations love the MBTI for communicational reasons, because they can bring two employees in, and you could say, for example, this employee's intuitive and this one's a sensor, and you can spend 15 minutes sitting them down explaining the differences between those two characteristics. And at the end of that short 15-minute period, the odds are those two employees are going to be able to understand each other a little bit better. And that's really important, and that's why the MBTI tends to succeed in the business psychology world, because it's not focused on success or how well you are doing. It is focused on the communicational and natural differences between two people. And that's kind of really what the MBTI is about. And the most important takeaway from that is that, yes, it is a soft science, and yes, it is far more of a qualitative tool than it is a quantitative tool. All right, let's talk about the history of the Big Five now. It's also referred to as the five-factor model, or OCEAN, and I don't know as much about the Big Five as I do the MBTI in regard to history, so I'm just going to tell you what I do know, and then we'll go on to discuss the important things. So the Big Five factor model, whatever you want to call it, we'll call it Big Five in this case, truly began its research in 1936 when a man named Gordon Allport put a hypothesis to test by extracting around 4,500 adjectives believed to be descriptors of human traits. This was eventually reduced down to 171. He would go on to create a self-report instrument around these adjectives that resulted in 5 factors that were measured human traits. Essentially, he was measuring how much of these traits someone was based on how they responded to these adjectives that he had taken from his lexical studies. Now, the Big Five began to kind of fall off research around this time in the mid, 1930s, 1940s, and it wouldn't become big again until around 1980. Specifically in 1980, a man named Louis Goldberg renewed research and coined the term Big Five when he really began to put a lot of work into studying the personality assessment again. That same year, 4 major researchers reviewed current personality assessments and decided that the Pentagon-based Big Five model was the most valid. Now, this is a big deal because that means at that time, these 4 researchers came together and looked at all the current personality assessments and decided that in regard to measuring personality, the Big Five was essentially the best. And it was actually followed by another version of the Big Five in second place, which is huge because that means that these major scientific people got together and thought that this was valid. Now, let's talk a little bit about what the Big Five is and its differences in regard to the MBTI. So the Big Five measures openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. It measures these 5 traits, and you might notice that I'm saying the word measure because the Big Five is telling you how much of these things you are. The MBTI does not and is not intended to do this, where the Big Five is telling you where you fall on a scale of these traits. It's telling you that if you score, 96% in extroversion, you are very extroverted, excuse me. Or if you score low in neuroticism, like 5 or 10%, then the odds are you're not going to be a person with a lot of negative emotion. This is important because it allows for quantitative research. And what that means is that we can apply these traits to studies and variables across different settings and tell how they relate to the things we're studying. One such famous example tends to be in the differences between how genders respond to this personality trait assessment. It is often noted that women tend to score about 10% higher on agreeableness and neuroticism, whereas men tend to score low in agreeableness. And the implications of this are what allows for quantitative inference, which is to say that we can look at this research and say that things happen because of these personality traits. You'll often probably note, if you're in the field of personality psychology, that Jordan Peterson uses the Big Five a lot. He has his own version of it, and he will often talk about gender differences in regard to the MBTI and the implications of that. To put such an example on the table, he often refers to the fact that those same gender studies can be performed in egalitarian nations, which is to say nations that are the most even between the genders. And then you will note that the differences in genders become more prominent in these egalitarian nations, which is to say that the less socio-cultural interference there is, the more that these gender differences become larger. And this is important because we can use this quantitative data to make inferences about certain variables. And that is pretty much the primary difference between MBTI and the Big Five, is that MBTI is designed for communication and subjective use, whereas the Big Five is designed for far more of a quantitative use to tell you exactly how much of something you are or where you fall on a normal distribution of people with these traits. And that will allow you to understand how different you are from another person who's taking the test. Whereas if 2 people took the MBTI and scored as the same personality type, there could be large differences between them and specific actions, but that's not as likely as if 2 people took the Big Five and got extremely similar scores. They are far more likely to be very similar in their mannerisms, actions, and traits. So to briefly summarize once again, the MBTI is designed to be a qualitative personality assessment that is far more focused on communication and understanding other people in the terms of the traits that it is measuring. Whereas the Big Five is designed to measure how much of a trait you have and what that implies about you and your actions and how you go about your life. The MBTI typically does not measure negative attributes and only focuses on natural habits, whereas the Big Five does measure negative attributes such as neuroticism. That is to say that if you scored high on neuroticism, you would be high in a negative trait, whereas the MBTI views none of its traits as negative. So I really hope that you learned something from this video. If you have anything else that you would like to see in regard to MBTI, Big Five, personality, please feel free to leave me a comment down below. I am going to be trying to make more videos here or there when I'm not, in my studies. Thank you for watching. This is Asura at Asura Psych. Have a good one.